Alright, I'm going to show you the difference between a 4-inch and a 6-inch slide rail on the Tandems. They look very different from each other. And yes, they do. There are plenty of trailers out here that use 6-inch holes. Every trailer I've ever pulled for JCT uses 6-inch rails, and I'll show you that in a second here. Alright, this is my trailer here. There are plenty of England trailers that have this setting, the same setup. This is a 6-inch rail setup. See how far apart the holes are from each other? If I measure it from the front of the hole to the front of the next hole, or from the back to the back, or whatever, doesn't matter, it should be 6 inches. If you see I put it on the front of this hole here, the front of the next hole is 6 inches away from it. If I go from the back to the back, it's also 6 inches. You got to use the same measurement standard. Basically, whatever side of the hole you're using on one, you got to use on the other hole as well. Then also, I want to take a look at how wide the holes are. This one appears to be a little over 1 3/4 inches, or right around 1 3/4. Now let's show you a different one here. There's a Dollar Tree trailer. That's 4-inch, and so does this. I think May Trucking over here. So I'll show you this here, okay? This is 4-inch. It's roughly the same diameter, but they're only 4 inches apart. So that's the difference between 4-inch and 6-inch trailer holes. There are plenty of them out here that have 6 inches. So the 250 pounds per hole, it's not so effective if you're using a trailer with 6-inch holes. Only works with 4s. If you have a 6-inch trailer, a 6-inch hole trailer, you want to use 375 per hole, or 400 if you want to round it. How I get that? Use the original 250. The common dimension of both 4-inch and 6-inch trailer holes can move by is 12 inches. So, and if you have a 4-inch hole trailer, it's 3 holes to get 12 inches, or 250 pounds times 3, that's 750. So if you move a foot, regardless of how many holes it is, you'll take 750 pounds off of one axle and put it on another. 6-inch trailer hole, 6-inch pattern here. There's only 2 holes. It only takes 2 holes to cover that. So if you basically take that 750 and divide it by 2, you get 375. So if you're working with 6-inch hole trailers, use 375 pounds per hole and not 250. If you don't have to move it very far, you're not going to get very much. You might not notice a difference there, but if you have to move the tandem, say 2 feet, or basically if you think you have to move it 6 holes, and you think you're working with a 4-inch hole trailer, but you're really working with a 6, you're going to move these tandems an entire foot further than you think you will. And it's going to cause you to take an extra 750 pounds off from what you think you will, and put it on the opposite axles. So this is where it's important to know what kind of slide rail pattern you're working with. They aren't all 4 inches here, as you see. Also, now the 250 and the 375 I use for if I have an overweight axle and all I want to do is just get it legal. However, for best safety practices, I always recommend try to make it as balanced as you can. Get your drive axles and your trailer axles as close to the same weight as you possibly can. An imbalanced trailer will be on a bad surface will be easier to lose control of and more difficult to regain control of if you do lose it. Well-balanced trailer is less prone to loss of control, and then if it does lose control, it's easier to regain control of. So those are the reasons why I always recommend try to balance your trailer as much as you can, or your axle weights as much as you can. in order to get the ideal balance, what I do is I subtract my heavier set of duals from my lighter set of duals. So let's just say my tandems are heavier than my drives. Every 1,500 pounds difference that you have between the two is 1 foot. So what I do is I just take the difference and then divide it by 1,500, and that tells me how many feet basically I need to move it. And then from there I just multiply it by however many holes there are per foot on the trailer. So if I have a 6-inch pattern, it's only 2 holes per foot. So my number of feet times 2, it will tell me exactly how many holes I need to move. If I'm working with a 4-inch hole trailer, same thing. Take my difference between the axle weights, divide it by 1,500, and then multiply that by 3. And that'll give me how many holes I want to move. And of course, you always move toward the heavier axle. Now keep in mind also, you do have some states that have limitations on how far back you can slide the tandems. You want to know what state you're going through and what their laws are. A lot of the states, you can kind of get away with running them illegally. A lot of times, some states do tend to be a little more, or at least some of the DOT officers seem to be a little more laid back on it or something. Or maybe just people aren't actually getting dragged into weigh stations with their tandems illegally positioned in those states. But there are some that are pretty strict, like California and Florida. They're both pretty strict. So make sure you know what all these states are. I'll include the information, like the tables on that. I recommend though, use the Motor Vehicle Carrier Atlas. If you don't have it, get it. When you do have it, get to page A16. Each state, they're on the far right side of the table there, on the last column on the right. If they do have a restriction, you'll see a bubble right there on the pointing to that particular state's line, and it'll tell you what its limit is. But I kind of made it easy. I put all these states that have limits and what their limits are in a table. And also the states that do have restrictions, that don't have a common dimension that they work with. Some, like California, go from the kingpin to the rear trailer axle. So in other words, if I'm in California, I need to measure from the kingpin to this axle here. Now, another way you can do that, because you don't want to be measuring 40 feet literally from there. So what you can do is, if you know that your trailer is 53 feet long, find out the distance from your kingpin to the front of the trailer. Usually it's 3 feet. So if you just consider it's 50 feet, now all you have to do to figure out what your kingpin to rear axle dimension is, or your KPRA as I call it, is to measure the distance from your rear axle to the ICC bar. So from the rear axle to the bar, if you're in California where the limit or the KPRA limit's 40 feet, you want this to be at least 10 feet. So basically, take 50 feet and subtract the distance from your ICC bar to your rear axle, and that's what your KPRA is. Now there are other states though that don't go by KPRA. They go by kingpin to center of the axle group. And what that means is, basically it goes where your pivot point is between the two axles. Your pivot point on a trailer with dual axles is not the rear axle. It's right halfway between the two. So right in between the two tires. So the way to measure this, if you don't have a good cheat sheet to work with, is measure the distance from your rear axle to your front axle. I've already done this many times. It's just about 4 feet. It's not exact, but it's pretty close to 4 feet. So your pivot point, or your center of your axle group, is right in the middle of that. So in other words, center of the axle group is about 2 feet forward of your rear axle and 2 feet after to the rear of your front axle. So if you know your kingpin to rear axle dimension, just subtract 2 feet, and that'll be where your kingpin to center of axle group dimension is. There are several states that go by that unit of measure, so that's why I say you want to know this stuff here, and you also want to know which states use which dimensions, because like I say, Tennessee, their limit, if you look in the atlas, it'll say 41 feet. However, the 41 feet is to the center of the axle group, not to the rear axle. So in other words, it should be 43 feet from the kingpin to the rear axle. Or if it's 43 feet, that means you need to have at least 7 feet of distance between your rear axle and your ICC bar. Okay, there are other states too, Illinois, pretty much all the states that start with the letter M, pretty much all of those I believe have restrictions. Both Virginias have limits. Now speaking of the Virginias, or which one is it, West Virginia, or one of the Virginias, they have a limit also, but it doesn't go by a kingpin to rear axle. They go by a certain tractor axle to a certain trailer axle. I get it mixed up with one of the other states, which I forget if it's Maine or someone else, but if it's one of those, it's from the rear tractor axle or the third axle to the rear trailer axle or the fifth axle. And then there's another state that's the third axle or the rear tractor axle to the front trailer axle or fourth axle. So these are all things you really should know if you're going to be a professional driver. So make sure you learn all this stuff and use get a hold of the atlas and try to memorize this stuff, or at least try to remember which states have limits, and then you can refer to it. Alright, that's all I have, and I'll show you the table here a little later, okay? Bye. Alright, this is my table that I used to identify which states have which dimension limits on them. If you don't see it listed here, it doesn't exist. Basically, I got all this information right off the Motor Vehicle Carrier Atlas, page A or Alpha 16, like I mentioned earlier. As you see here, California has a 40-foot kingpin to rear axle limit. District of Columbia, there's not really much of anywhere in DC you can actually drive with a semi. Really a very small amount of I-95 or basically, and hardly of any real interest there. Florida, if you look in the atlas, it'll say 41 feet, but that's to the center of the axle group, not to the rear axle. So as you'll see here, if you go from the rear to the rear axle, it's 43 feet. You also see here Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Tennessee, Vermont, Virginia, West Virginia, and a little too small for me to see it from the right now. I think that's Wisconsin. All those states have restrictions or dimension restrictions on them in one way or another. So if you see that it's KPRA, that's kingpin to rear axle, and you'll see the notes down at the bottom that explain what these all mean. And then KPCG is the kingpin to center of the axle group, which I explained both of those earlier. And then you'll see Maine is the third axle to the fifth axle, or the rear tractor axle to the rear trailer axle. And then West Virginia is from the rear tractor axle to the front trailer axle. Those axle to axle dimensions can be a little more tricky to measure, because you have to consider where your fifth wheel is actually positioned and where that third axle is in relation to where your fifth wheel is. So that's more or less how I would try to figure that out if I really needed to. Generally, I don't normally worry so much about it, to be honest with you. But if you want to make sure you don't ever have to worry about getting a ticket for being over length, it's really important to know all this information and make sure you're actually legal every time. So All right, that's all I have on this. I'm going to talk about something else here too, with respect to when you have to move both both your tandems and your fifth wheel. Okay. Okay, I'm going to finish this by talking about if you have those situations where both your steers are overweight and one of your drives are, or one of your dual axles are also. Doesn't matter which the case is, whether it's your steers and your drives or your steers and your tandems. My advice is only move one at a time. So move your tandems first always, and then once you finish moving your tandems, get back on the scale and rescale it, and then find out where you're at then. And then once you have that information, then if you need to move your fifth wheel still, then do it. Don't try to move your fifth wheel on your tandems all at the same time and then rescale it all after a single move. You might find that you might not even have to move your fifth wheel. A good example of this is if your steers are overweight and your tandems are overweight, take a look at where your fifth wheel is positioned. There's basically like a center point or like a fulcrum somewhere in there. I don't know where it's at. It's an unknown dimension. Basically, the closer you are to the center point, from either extreme, the less likely you are to have this problem come up. But if you're at either extreme, doesn't matter if your fifth wheel is all the way forward or all the way back, you can run into this problem. If your tandems are overweight, what it basically does is pulls up a little bit on the fifth wheel in a way. And when it does that, it pulls up a little bit on the drive axles and makes them lighter than they really are. And by doing that, it also pushes down on the steer tires. So it might, just by being off balance, too heavy on the tandems, that could be the reason why your steer tires are also overweight. So this is another reason why I recommend move your tandems first. Get them as close to balanced as you can. But now if your steers are overweight, you might want to try to bias your weight a little bit toward the tandems. That way, if your steer tires really are still going to be overweight, then you have room to move some of that weight from using your fifth wheel slide, if it applies, from your steers to your drives without making your drives go overweight or something like that. If your drives are overweight and if you can't, if your tandems are all the way forward already, your only option from there really is to slide your fifth wheel to try to get some of the weight to transfer to your steer axles. Speaking of all these axle weights, there's a standard, that's generally followed of 12,000 for the steers and 34 each for the drives and trailer axles or tandems. That's not always the case though. Every state has its own limitations on axles. Again, this is another case where have that motor vehicle carrier atlas available to you, because that'll tell you what the actual limits are. You might be at, say, 34.5 or even 35,000 on let's say your trailer axles. Oh yeah, you think you're overweight? Okay, well maybe take a look at the MVC atlas. You might find out what states you're going to be dealing with. They might actually allow you to be like 36,000 or something. There are states out here that do have higher limits than 34,000. I want to say there were a good 17 states in all that had some kind of limit above 34,000. They kind of varied, but if I remember reading right, if I remember the numbers right, it was about 17 states that actually have a higher limit. Steer axle is also the same situation there. Generally, your equipment limitation is what takes precedence, as well as what the state is, or whichever is more restrictive. I would recommend take a look at your tires. Look at the side on them. It'll tell you what the max load rating is on it. So, on a lot of steer tires, the limit is 6,175 per tire, or about 12,350 total. But now if the state has a limit of 12,000, then you still got to go by the 12,000 limit. But there are plenty of other states that have higher limits for single axles or steers, whatever. They could be as high as 20,000 pounds for all you know. So this is again a case where have that motor vehicle carrier atlas handy. Page A16, I swear, is the Bible. You can't go wrong with that. You can possibly save yourself some hassle of trying to get a load reworked or something if you find out that the states that you're dealing with might actually allow your weights to be where they already are. So that's all I have on this. Hope you had a lot of good information on here. I'm not going to go over how to slide the tandems for those of you who might not already have a CDL, because I mainly intended this for a group where everyone already has a license anyway, but I'm going to put it on my YouTube. I'm currently loaded and in California, and I don't want to have to go through all the hassle of trying to demonstrate how to slide tandems. Plus, I think there are plenty of YouTube videos out there already that kind of cover that subject. So that's all I have. Just want to make sure you guys are aware of other things that you probably aren't getting information about elsewhere. So let me know if you have any questions or comments on this. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. Thanks.